takes me a minute to work on the tech stuff. I'm better with my boots in the forest. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carolyn Thickett. I'm the Conservation Director at the Escarpment Corridor Alliance. We're really happy that you're joining this session with an extremely interesting gentleman who does a lot of really interesting research from the University of Waterloo. So this is Dan Kraus. He's a conservation scientist with over 20 years of experience in the NGO sector, including a senior conservation biologist with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. He serves on Canada's Nature Advisory Committee, teaches at the University of Waterloo, and works with governments, First Nations, foundations, industry, and NGOs to help transform biodiversity conservation. He's a strong advocate for accessible science. His work has been featured in media across the country. Dan lives with his family at the headwaters of Bronte Creek, where he enjoys chopping wood and raising happy chickens. Happy chickens. I have no chickens. I once had bees. But a little bit of insight into who Dan is, and his research is amazing.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can you hear me without the mic, or should I use the mic?
Mic.
Use the mic. Okay, I will use the mic then. It's a real pleasure to be here. I live very close to the Niagara Escarpment, and part of my nature prescription is getting out almost every day. I did almost get an overdose of nature about 7 years ago when I had some time off work with a friend of mine. We decided we'd hike the entire first trip from end to end, which we did in about 32 days. But I still remember kind of getting to this part of the Escarpment, where for the last 2 weeks it's kind of been like, you feel like you're in nature, but you're just kind of in this rhythm. But suddenly you kind of get up to the southern part of Georgian Bay, you see the water, you realize how high you are. It's like, well, no wonder I'm so tired. But also it's like nature suddenly becomes like the dominant feature in this area, just realizing like what a special part of the world this was. So there's a couple things I'm hoping that I can leave you with at the end of the day. But the first one is I want to share some of my research about wildlife in Canada. I learned about some of the species that we've lost, but also some of the ones that we have saved. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit at the end of the presentation about some work that Carolyn and I are doing, looking at developing an action plan for the species of risk that live within this area. And this would actually be the first community-led species at risk action plan under our Federal Species at Risk Act, which is kind of a cool experiment. So I think a lot about nature. And there are sometimes I feel like it's really, really complex in terms of thinking about how do we measure the state of nature, how do we measure the trends and what's happening, how do we measure how effective our conservation actions are. Canada's nature strategy has dozens and dozens of different indicators to measure nature. And for my work with measuring the state of the Great Lakes or the state of Ontario biodiversity strategy, I just sometimes worry that with all these indicators, we're destined to always have these report cards where we're doing fair. Some things are good, some things are bad. We're somewhere in the middle. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about if we could only pick a couple indicators to measure how we're doing, what would they be? And I really think wildlife is one of those. And there's a few reasons for that. I mean, wildlife, the state in terms of the diversity, the abundance, the population trends, reflects what we're doing locally. Also reflects some of the global issues that are facing nature, like climate change. Wildlife resonates with people. And also, wildlife is really sort of the original origin of conservation. From a Western perspective, some of the first laws around nature were game laws that were introduced in North America in the 1700s to protect declining populations. Some of our first protected areas, including Last Mountain Lake in Saskatchewan and Algonquin Park, were partially established to protect declining populations of nature. And I sometimes think that, with wildlife declining, we need to cut ourselves a little bit of slack because this whole concept of losing nature is relatively new within our Western mindset. You go back 200, 250 years ago, and the concept of extinction didn't even exist. The Lewis and Clark expedition that was sent out into the U.S. West to explore, part of their mission was to look for mammoth, because they had found mammoths in Kentucky and Virginia mammoth bones, and they assumed that this thing must just be somewhere else, and maybe Lewis and Clark could find it in the West. Some of our earliest extinctions, like gray hawk and even passenger pigeon, there were always people denying these extinctions because they thought they had just gone somewhere else. Senators from Ohio say passenger pigeons can't be gone. There were so many, they must just be in Canada somewhere. Even with bison, there was that thought, as the herds were dwindling, people were, they've just gone somewhere else. But there's no question now, sorry, Carolyn's getting a clicker. No question now that we are experiencing what sometimes we refer to as the sixth extinction. Extinction is part of life on Earth. There's more species that have gone extinct than we have now, but we've accelerated these rates of extinction. Scientists estimate they're up to 1,000 times greater than historical background extinctions, and we know that up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the coming decades. I think it's important that are at risk, so their fate hasn't been decided yet. And globally, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which assesses the conservation status of species globally, has identified that there's almost 50,000 species that are at risk around the world. And what concerns me is sort of the types of species that we're assessing as at risk is changing. When I was a kid, it was all about things that were rare. They lived in a small part of the world, or they're like whooping cranes where there's only a few hundred left. But now we have species like white ash, which is listed on that global list of species. Species like monarch, species like bobolink, wood thrush. All these species, they're still common, they're still widespread, but they're rapidly declining. And we know from lessons from the past, from bison or passenger pigeon, that even species that are common and widespread, if they're declining at a rapid rate, that can be a road to extinction. In Canada, despite being such a massive country that is still blessed with a lot of nature, we still have a lot of species at risk. Federally, there's a group called the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada that assesses species before they can go on to our federal Endangered Species Act, which is called the Species at Risk Act in Canada, and we're up to almost 900 species. I think what's important is that this list, it's partly related to just the capacity of experts to assess the extinction risk of species. Other studies have shown that probably 1 in 5 species in Canada is at some level of risk of extinction. And we know that in Canada we have about 1,500 species that are global conservation concerns, so we have very high jurisdictional responsibility for these. The decisions we make about their conservation and their decline affects not just biodiversity and conservation in Canada, but around the world. And we also know what many of the key threats are for these species. It's habitat loss, invasive species, overexploitation, which we've done a better job of for many terrestrial species, but it still affects many marine species, and pollution, including things like neonicotinoids, which we heard about this morning. And we have a pretty good idea of where these species are in Canada. Canada, like the rest of the world, tends to have higher species diversity in the south versus the north. It's important to remember that from a biological perspective, we're a really young country. Like 15,000 years ago, all this was covered in ice, so most of the species that are here are either ones that hung on to these little glacial refugia in the mountains and then places in the Arctic where they colonized in that time. So most of our species at risk are in the south, which unfortunately, and not completely coincidentally, is also where our human footprint is the highest. So where our farms, our cities, our homes are as well. Next slide. So this research started out because when I was a kid, these two species had very different conservation status and have changed. So back in the 1970s, this swift fox, which lives on the prairies, didn't exist anymore in Canada. It probably disappeared by the 1930s. Conversely, this greater prairie chicken, which once occurred in Ontario, including in this area, was endangered because it had declined, and it's gone now. So the question was, why do some species improve in conservation status, and why do some disappear? So these were sort of the questions I wanted to ask. The one is, how many species have we actually lost in Canada? I thought that's kind of a depressing research to pursue, so we should probably balance that with how many species have we actually saved, recognizing there are species like swift fox or the trumpeter swan, which I showed earlier on in the picture, in the slideshow. But more importantly, to think about what's the distribution, the timing, the causes, and are there lessons that we can learn from this loss and this recovery that we can apply to do better conservation today? So what was the approach we took? Well, first we looked at all of the different data sets out there that report on species that are extinct, extirpated, or historical. So extinct means they're gone from the world, things like passenger pigeons. Extirpated, they're gone from Canada, but we may find them in other places, largely the US. So greater prairie chicken is an example. Historical species are ones where we just don't have any records of them. We're not sure. We haven't made the call if they're extinct or if they're extirpated, but we haven't seen them in many cases for 40, 50, even 100 years. And so it's very likely that they are gone. And we looked at a bunch of different data sources for this. We looked at CSIWA, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, that federal body that assesses national extinction risk, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the global body, NatureServe, which is a group that assesses the global and national ranks of species in North America, but also looked at other global databases and literature as well. And then we had experts review this information, recognizing there was a lot of unknowns and we needed some help with some of the data. For the recovered species, we consider the species recovered or improved in conservation status if that federal body that assesses risk had put them into a lower conservation risk category. So maybe it was assessed as endangered 20 years ago, but now it's assessed as special concern, which is a lower risk extinction for that species. The one thing we did that no one had done before is we tried to figure out if those changes in status were what we call genuine or non-genuine. I'll talk about this a bit more, but genuine changes are like because we actually did something about it. Non-genuine changes are sometimes because experts change criteria around if a species is endangered or not, or also we have new information about the species. Typically, we find more of them. Also recognize that Canada's Species at Risk Act is only about 20 years old, and there's lots of conservation in our Canadian history that happened way before that time. So we reviewed all kinds of historical documents to look for information about species that were maybe recorded as being like rare or endangered or scarce, like going way back into the early 1900s, which was a really interesting exercise to review those documents. And it was surprising that there are species today like wood duck that it's hard to believe that 120 years ago or so was considered as something that could actually go extinct. It's part of the reason why there was a migratory bird agreement between Canada and the US. Wood duck was one of these species where it's like we need to cooperate on not over-harvesting this species. Species like white pelican, which has made a tremendous comeback in Ontario and the rest of Canada, or the elephant seal on the west coast. So we did find in this historical literature this like wonderful stories about species where people like us 150, 100 years ago were really concerned that they were going to disappear and not be here anymore. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly just talk about some of the results. What did we find when we looked at all this data? Well, the one thing was there were a lot more species that seemed to be missing from our Canadian portfolio of wildlife than has been recorded before. We came up with a little over 200 species that are extinct, extirpated, or historical. We tracked kind of what drove the loss of those species. For some of them, it was really hard to tell. Like we couldn't figure out why it had maybe disappeared. But it was clearly habitat loss was a key factor. Overexploitation historically, but has certainly gotten better. Invasive species has driven the loss of some Canadian species, and ecosystem modifications, which you can kind of think of that in two groups. One is around fire, usually fire suppression in fire-dependent ecosystem caused some species to disappear, and especially in Western Canada, water modifications, like either draining areas or flooding areas has caused the loss of some species. We identified that there's 18 species which federally were considered endangered that are actually probably gone already. I mean, that's okay. Federal bodies don't want to declare something extinct or extirpated if we actually still have it, because that could remove conservation actions. But again, recognizing there's a lot more species that we've lost than we really account for. We also identified that there were 15 species that were formerly gone from Canada that are now back. So kind of good news stories for some of them. That was either by rescue, which just means that the US maybe did some conservation work and those populations have expanded into Canada. So examples of species that have been rescued in Canada included the elephant seal. I showed you there's a few other marine species. Kirkland warbler is a great example of where they've done amazing work in Michigan to restore these young jack pine systems, and the Kirkland warbler populations are now starting to spill into Ontario. And also reintroduction. So swift fox is an example, wild turkey is an example of a species that didn't exist in the 1970s, but was reintroduced when Ontario traded some, I think otters maybe for the turkeys. I don't know how the otters have done, but the turkeys have certainly done really well. But the one thing we identified is this loss is continuing. This graph is kind of showing like the cumulative total of species that we've lost in Canada, kind of flat lines near the top, but that's only because we haven't had enough time to determine if these species are actually gone or not. But we have lots of examples of species that were last seen in like the 1990s or even the early 2000s and are clearly gone now from Canada. Next slide. And we mapped where these species, where these losses have occurred. So throughout much of Canada, not surprisingly, it's very similar to that map of where the highest densities of species at risk are, is where we've lost more species, we had more lose, and also you have places like Southern Ontario, where the landscape and the habitats have been heavily modified. So as Bruce mentioned this morning, we are kind of the extinction hotspot of Canada. Next slide. So that was kind of the depressing part of the project. The next was, what are some of these bright spots? Like where have we actually, through our conservation actions, improved the status of species? So we identified 49 species that have improved for genuine reasons. And some of that included things like harvest management. So for some fisheries or marine mammals, like we just stopped unsustainable harvest or just stopped harvesting them at all. That really improved their status. Starting to see signals around protected areas and stewardship improving conservation status of species, which was really interesting. These are generally for species that occur in small areas, they have small ranges, there's not many. But if you can protect the land around those species, if you can remove the threats, it actually can reduce extinction risk quite quickly. Some of them it was like under 20 years where they were recovering. We also identified 54 species we call like legacy recoveries. So recognizing that people were working on things like trumpeter swan, wood duck, decades and decades before, and even by the time we had the Species at Risk Act, those species were well on the road to recovery. So we want to recognize those historical efforts, mainly around mammals and birds, that have reduced their extinction risk. We benefit today because of those actions that were taken. The one thing that we found that was a little disturbing was that 61% of the species that were assessed in the lower risk category, so that federal body, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, had put them into a lower risk category, was for a non-genuine reason. So it wasn't because of conservation action. It was because we found more of them. And we call this recovery by discovery. And there's all kinds of issues with this. I mean, there is a good news component to it that we thought there was only a few occurrences of flooded jelly skin lichen or some turtles, and we found out there's actually more. The challenge is that you have to think about the opportunity costs of that. These resources to assess species, to list species under the federal act, to do planning for these species, and then to find out, oh, actually we had more than we thought. It's very inefficient compared to putting more money up front to do baseline inventories to figure out what's the actual conservation of these status, the actual conservation status of these species before we invest in their recovery. But yeah, lots of examples, like bluebird is a great example where it was considered at one point to be rare, but because of stewardship actions from people, it has improved in status. So what does all this mean? I mean, the whole point of doing this research is, come up with some cool numbers and facts, but really it's to help inform us, to use this history of species loss and species recoveries to do better conservation today. And so as I mentioned, there are these examples, not many, but they are growing, of where new protected and conserved areas, some of them by federal government, some by land trusts, have resulted in rapid recovery of these species with small ranges and small population sizes, and were really important for preventing future extinctions. I think this is a really, really important group to invest in, and I think it's also important as we think about recovering species there are these species where, like within the career of a conservation biologist, I mean, we can actually improve their conservation status and reduce their extinction risk. There are other species though, those ones that are widespread but declining rapidly, like monarch or white ash, where it may require generations to recover some of those species. And we see that historically, species like trumpeter swan or peregrine falcon. You know, it did take decades to recover those species. So we maybe need different approaches to planning and management for those sort of two groups of what makes species endangered. That's developing these different recovery strategies. Right now we use the same template for both groups of species, but we really need to think more about the species we could recover really rapidly with like strategic, smart land protection and stewardship versus the species that have like these pervasive threats. And we need to really have this long game conservation plan for them if we're going to recover them. The other one is we need to expand these preemptive conservation actions. We know many species which are at risk, which are not yet officially assessed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife or on Canada's list. Let's protect them now. Let's not wait until they are officially assessed and listed. It's much more efficient from both an economic perspective and from a conservation perspective. The other one was that for many species, if we actually are going to recover them, improve their conservation status and reduce the risk, we need to do more ambitious translocations and reintroductions. Canada is way behind many other countries in terms of the ambition of actually reintroducing species to where they have been lost. You know, it's funny because with fish and game, right, we move stuff willy-nilly all over the place. But maybe it's just kind of the nature of conservation science, is like very conservative about these types of approaches. But there's many species where this is what we need to do if we are going to improve their conservation status. And the neat thing about this is like, this creates good news stories, right? Like you have the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, you know, releasing baby landing turtles in Rouge Park. But like people love these kinds of stories. So they're important not just from a conservation perspective, but for engaging the public as well. A couple other things, just highlighting the importance of community science, and that to avoid more of these recovery by discoveries, we should be engaging people to help find some of these species before they're sent off to scientists to do these official assessments. There's all kinds of species where, you know, there could be targeted bioblitzes to look for them, so we actually have more information to assess their extinction risk. And also encouraging people to look for some of these missing species. Some of the 201 species on our list, like we know they're gone. Like you're not going to go out and find a passenger pigeon. I'm sorry, but there are a few where maybe they could exist, and we actually did put a confidence code to the likelihood that they could be discovered. Some of them occur in very remote areas. Some of them you do kind of need some expertise to find, but that is something that community science can help with. As I mentioned, providing storytelling about loss and recovery. You know, there are these stories that are both stories about wildlife, but also about people that help to bring these species back. And also, you know, bending the curve on biodiversity loss. Ultimately, you know, every species that has recovered, there's a people or there's community behind it, and we need to better empower these groups to act and to help our species recover. So I want to talk a little bit about, you know, I think one of the actions we can take is to build sort of this community-led species at risk action plans. So this has never really been done in Canada. The government likes to do a lot of planning around species at risk. And you know, some people I think say because, well, you know, it's easier for the government to do planning, right? As opposed to actual on the ground action. And it creates a very long process for species where action can sometimes happen. So if you are a species that might be at risk, you have to go through this process of being assessed by that Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. Then you may or may not get listed on the Act. Most species are. Then it can be a couple years until a recovery strategy or what's called a recovery strategy or management plan is created. And then there's an action plan, which the federal government is going to create. And there's a few examples where this planning period has actually resulted in the loss of species. So we need to be more act more quickly on this. But the action plan is really the document that is supposed to provide guidance about what do we actually need to do on the ground. Recovery documents sort of set things like objectives, but it's the action plan that sort of sets the marching orders for what do we need to do on the ground. And most action plans have been done by Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Parks Canada, and Canadian Wildlife Service. And they're all done a little differently, which is interesting. There were some early attempts for communities to step up and develop action plans, but the government said these aren't compliant with the Species at Risk Act. So what we've done is we've talked to a lot of our government partners and said, well, what if we actually follow the Species at Risk Act to the T in terms of what we put into a recovery strategy? And could a community develop and lead a conservation plan that is part of and recognized as part of the Species at Risk Act and supported by the government, but not government-led? Something that is bottom-up instead of being top-down. So this is a big experiment. We don't know if this is going to work. Been getting sort of mixed messages from different government departments. I think there's some people in government who that's kind of been their role, is to do that planning. But we know, and I think there's lots of evidence that shows that plans that are created by communities are actually much more likely to be effective and can often be more cost effective as well. So I think maybe our timing for this is very good as we're kind of looking at probably increased austerity from the federal government. Could a community plan help the government to achieve objectives of the Species at Risk Act, but also result in better conservation outcomes? So what we're looking at doing is combining aquatic and terrestrial species in this plan. Right now, a lot of aquatic species, all that planning is done by Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Terrestrial species, all that planning is done by Environment Canada Climate Change. So you have this weird situation where turtles are in the same area as where there's a rare fish are kind of managed by different agencies. So the question is, could we integrate these? And could we also include other species of conservation concerns, that preemptive conservation? So we have species here, like there's some rare lichens right around here that only occur in a few locations in Ontario. Why don't we protect those now instead of waiting until they're on the Species at Risk Act? And also recognizing that there may be species that are of community importance or cultural significance, and incorporating those into the plan as well. So right now we're just at the stage where we're assembling information on all these species at risk and other species of conservation concern in this area. We're at just under 60 species, so it's quite a few. Going through some of the federal recovery strategies to see what are the objectives and what can be the contribution here to the recovery of those species, recognizing that some like harvest-tongued fern, most of the Canadian and even global population is in this area. It's really, really important what we do here. Other species like wood thrush, this is a really, really important area, but it certainly is a very shared responsibility across quite a large part of Eastern Canada. And then the question also is, what kind of government support can we get, and can we eventually get government buy-in to protect these species? But at the very least, at the end, what we're going to have is a plan that identifies very specific actions that will have an important impact on many species at risk, and so we can kind of play our role in bending that curve on biodiversity loss. So I'll say thanks for that. Happy to answer any questions, and also it'd be great if we could have a little bit of discussion around Canada's first multi-species community-based action plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was very informative. As climate change continues to roll out and temperatures rise, we're going to see new species coming into Canada. Are we tracking the numbers and types of animals that are coming into Canada from the U.S.?
Yeah, we are, and those would be in two groups. I mean, there are invasive species that are coming in from the U.S., like kudzu or emerald ash borer originating in the U.S. But there are native species as well, and there's a whole suite of things from cardinal to turkey vultures to opossums that 100 years ago would have been quite rare on the landscape. Yeah, so those are being tracked. Typically, those species, as they start to come into Canada, aren't really considered species at risk if it looks like they're just going to keep increasing in populations, because that trend in population is an important consideration.
Since I've lived up here, I've met the sand crane, which I found is quite an amazing bird. And so I read a little bit about it. I'm not sure if I'm correct here, but it had a program in Markham, was it, that they tried to keep the population up, and now the population's doing really well, and then I read, now they're gonna hunt them again.
Yeah, so sandhill cranes are certainly one of these conservation success stories. Like one of these birds, like I never saw as a kid, and I keep like pointing them out to my kids. I think there's a point where like, you see them all the time, Dad. Like just lay off. But yeah, they are hunted out west. The numbers have really increased. I'm not sure what the global population is now, but they are hunted. I think in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Called ribeye of the sky if you're a hunter. That may come to Ontario or not.
That's what I read.
Yeah, yeah.
So, who decides that, and how do you decide when is a good time to not hunt them? You know, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, it is, ultimately, it's going to become a values question. From a population perspective, you know, just like hunting waterfowl, you know, now we can manage seasons and quotas and coordinate with the US. I mean, is not a threat to their population numbers. So this model of wildlife management that's been going on for over 100 years, and I'm sure that we can hunt sandhill cranes in a way that's not going to affect their population. The value comes in and like, wow, you know, we just saved them, and now we're going to hunt this like, you know, magnificent bird. Same thing may happen with trumpeter swans as well. I mean, that is just like the most amazing conservation success story where we thought they were absolutely gone, like from the world, extinct, and some were found in northern BC, and X went to Yellowstone, and then South Dakota, and then Manitoba, and made their way to Ontario, and like another bird you see pretty frequently, and I suspect in like the next 10 years there may be some question, could we actually hunt the world's largest waterfowl again?
Okay.
We've been sort of talking about the importance of ecological corridors and connectedness, and can you just talk about that in terms of species at risk, whether that's what the interaction between lack of connectivity and species at risk?
Yeah. So I mean, as we saw in Jody's presentation this morning, I mean, you know, there's like these large space-demanding animals that need connectivity, and we are actually seeing some of those come back to many parts of southern Ontario. Like I think Bruce mentioned, the pine marten, you know, Fisher is another example. So bears and things like that. So that will happen with these large, kind of connected, forested mosaics. It is also really important on like a small local scale as well. So an example is there's a tiny, sweet little frog called a chorus frog. It's basically an annual frog. Like it only lives for a year and then it dies. Used to be quite widespread, is gone from like large parts of its range. And that is probably because, you know, historically you would have like these, you know, little micro extinctions that would happen in their habitats, but they were connected habitats. So when there was a good year over here, they could kind of go and, you know, fill in these empty habitats. But with fragmented landscapes, that's not happening. So when these populations kind of blink out, there's no sort of source population that's connected to feed them anymore. So it is important when we think of connectivity to think of like these big grand corridors that we have with the microscarp and keep building that up, but also kind of think about how we can create these local connections between some of these populations of species at risk.
Sorry, I don't know if there's a
Oh, no, sorry.
This morning we heard about the overpasses and underpasses for wildlife in the western part of Canada. And I know on the Bruce Peninsula, Southern Peninsula, there's some underpasses through in wetland areas on the roadway into the park. Is there an equivalent in Ontario to look at roads and passageways for creatures and something municipalities and counties should be talking about?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was about initiatives in Ontario around wildlife crossings for roads. There's a group called the Ontario Road Ecology Network that's really been pushing this. There are lots of examples municipally where these things are being created, and especially with new construction. So I've seen them around Guelph, I've seen them in Mississauga. There are examples where roads are closed seasonally for the migration, the little micro-migration of like certain amphibians. Like in Burlington and York region, they close some roads for Jefferson salamander, like those rainy night days in April when like amphibians are moving all over the place. So there is this initiative, and you do see them like along like the 400 highway going up to Parry Sound. They put all that fencing and underpasses, and we should be asking for them. Like every time there's any kind of like new construction or retrofit, and more than often, like I find like MTO or whoever's like advocating for the road, they're happy to build them, and like they can be really expensive, but the total budget of a road, like they're, you know, it's a rounding error in like the budgets that they deal with.
Can I tell you that the MTO is happy to build?
I don't see so long, but when my father was born in 1928. He said that when he was young, there were no Canada geese anywhere.
Yeah.
And he was a duck hunter, and when I was born in 58, he would take me duck hunting, let's say 68 through the early 70s. And there were geese and ducks, and they sort of seemed to be lots of both. Now there's lots of geese and very few ducks. And we used to live in Toronto, and there's a million geese there that seem to stay there all year round and this kind of thing, and there's very few ducks now compared to what there was. And I don't know if anybody knows this, but how much of this is sort of caused by human and man encroachment on nature and all this stuff versus is this a natural progression that ducks and geese, or I don't know, like enough about them, but does one take over for a while and the other one suffers and will ducks come back and geese suffer ever, or are they kind of what's going on?
Yeah, I don't know if there is kind of a ratio. They don't necessarily compete. I mean, certainly in parks with like mountain ducks and canned geese, I mean, they're eating the same grass or donuts or whatever people are giving them. But we know in general like waterfowl populations are increasing despite continuing wetland loss. Most waterfowl populations are doing quite well. There are some exceptions like black ducks, which tend to nest like a little bit further north. Those do seem to be declining.
The ducks are okay in general?
In general, waterfowl are doing quite well. Yeah, every sort of 5 or 10 years, there's a State of Canada birds report that's created. And there are some groups, like waterfowl raptors are doing better than they were when we were kids. But then there is this whole other group of like forest birds, shorebirds, and especially grassland or open country birds are all declining quite rapidly.
Okay. Because it seems like he's taken over everything.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
I wanted to ask about invasive. Invasive means just a whole lot, like they're not, it's not really that they've come in necessarily, they've just started to expand. Is that what invasive really means?
Yeah, these are typically species where there's no natural predators or controls on them. So for example, emerald ash borer, this insect that's come in, although there are some parasitic wasps and woodpeckers are like learning to eat them, there's nothing that's controlling them right now. So they're able to spread very, very rapidly.
And new species have to come from somewhere else, don't they? Or like, because they're not new if they've been here and they're just happy. What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, these are typically species that are have come into
like the possum.
Canada through global trade.
And then I wanted to just have you reflect on measurement. It's not really an exactive science because there's so many different ways of categorizing that have come through, or words that mean something different, and you really can't know whether it's pollution or a predator, or there's so many factors that you can't say for sure, right? That this group has declined because of.
Yeah, it's challenging. For some groups we can. I mean, we can see that clearly habitat loss is affecting them.
Yeah.
But that is one of the big challenges. If you look back historically, it was overexploitation was like the major threat. And, there's been tremendous work to abate that. But now many species at risk, they're facing multiple threats. So it does make it more challenging. So you can protect an area, but if climate change is a critical threat, that's not necessarily what you do.
That'll wipe that out. Got it.
I think we have to end here because we do have more exciting stuff to come. So I just want to say thank you so much, Dan, for sharing not only your research, but also this new fun experimental project that we're doing together. We really hope it turns into, well, it will be a really great resource for us as a community to consider how we want to be protecting species at risk that live in our area. But yeah, if we can turn this into something else that goes up to the national level and just really changes the face of conservation, I think that's a huge one. Thank you so much, Dan.